You know, when I was at QCon New York and at GoTo Chicago, I gave talks about control and observability in continuous delivery. And the idea was, how do the big companies like Booking.com and LinkedIn and others, how do they roll out tons of features but have safety and control and really fast learning? Like, how do they actually get all this done? And how, to those companies, those tools have really become as fundamental and foundational, kind of important, as version control and automating continuous integration. I spent most of my time at those shows chatting with senior developers, tech leads, architects, and the like, and most with a lot of experience, right? And what was interesting for me was that about half of them were just being introduced to feature flags, or just kind of getting their head around the model. The other half had been using them for a while in one way or another. What struck me the most wasn't that only half the people were using feature flags in some way at this point, but that all those people I talked to, only one team had a repeatable way to observe how it's going. Only one team had a mechanism in place where they could measure how their rollouts were going reliably and kind of in a repeatable way. The rest were just winging it. And they're using ad hoc queries, kind of begged favors here and there to figure out what's going on or whether it's going well. And okay, winging it may be a little strong. I get that you guys care about what you're doing, no question about that, right? But the issue was, when I asked about sort of how do you figure out if it's going well or not, the answers were usually, well, you know, we look here, we look there, we poke around a little bit, we run some queries, might ask a favor from somebody who has access to some other analytics. It's very ad hoc, and it's just way too random and way too prone to chance of finding or not finding something based on any given day. And it's also prone to something called observer bias, which you can Google. So this really isn't rocket science, right? The idea behind doing gradual rollouts is to get some sense of how it's going before you roll it out to everybody. And maybe you're doing that because you got a really early version of the code and you're just trying to get some feedback, or maybe you think you're done, but you want to make sure you don't blow up your infrastructure. The point is, you're trying something and you're going to see how it's going, right? And so obviously the ability to watch how it's going is just fundamental and foundational. If I'm sending 10% of my users through my new code, which is that upper lane you see there going through that new feature in the blue, if I'm sending 10% of them there, I'm really interested in knowing whether the way my system behaves or whether the users behave is significantly different between the people that are going that way and the people that aren't, right? So maybe I'm worried about response time, error rates, crashes, whatever, clicks, subscribes, maybe the user behavior. But I'm trying to figure out, by exposing this to a little bit of my population, how it's going. So let's think about that. If you got 10% of people going through the new code and 90% going through the old code, I'm sort of dipping my toes in the water, right, to see how it's going for those 10%. But things would have to go really catastrophically bad or fantastically well for them to show up in global stats. Like if I'm doing my statistics of the whole population and I'm looking for some evidence of how's it going, well, they're going to have to be ginormous impact, good or bad, for me to see them easily. But if I'm zoomed into each of those cohorts, if I'm looking at the stats just for that 10%, those stats are going to leap out at me in like high resolution. So each of the systems that I reviewed in my GoTo and my QCon talks had built up this kind of built-in observability. And they'd done this over quite some time and in multiple revs. I mean, if you look at the LinkedIn example, they started with a system that could do the feature flagging, and the analysis was all done by hand, right? And by their own admission, it would take like 2 weeks, and so it was almost never done. And then they wanted to build automation, and so they took a first crack at auto-calculating metrics, but because the metrics weren't consistent, people didn't believe them, right? They would flap. The example they gave was one day it's 50% up, another day it's 50% down. And so they kept iterating, and they built a system that was reliable and they could depend on. And now today, there's a new release of something going out with automatic instrumentation built in every 5 minutes, right? And there's thousands of metrics people can subscribe to get a sense of what's moving a needle for their business. You know, whether you call this more evolved way of doing things an experimentation platform or just, you know, feature flagging with built-in metrics, once you see the value of automating the feedback loop, you can't really go back. It becomes kind of a no-brainer. Again, it's like building continuous integration. Once you have a build server that builds your software for you when you push a button, the idea of building it by hand and figuring out the dependencies and kind of stitching it together a bit at a time just doesn't make sense anymore. We'll talk more about these metrics, like how to choose them, what are guardrail metrics, how to avoid sort of being over-focused on the local problem and not, break the rest of your system. We'll talk about that in another episode. For now, there's a great blog post you can read on choosing metrics by my colleague Sophie Harpur. I'll provide a link to that in the show notes. Have a great day.